Mirror's Edge opens with a pitch.
Runners see the city in a different way. We see the flow. Rooftops become pathways and conduits, possibilities, and routes to escape. The flow is what keeps us running, keeps us alive.
Those are the words of protagonist Faith Connors, but the idea being described is one that the game wants its players to inhabit. The game is appealing to our desire to turn a city into our personal playground, something that exists for the express purpose of having its gaps exploited, an arbitrary obstacle for us to overcome in a way that subverts its intended design. This also happens to be the pitch of parkour, a real-life activity and sporting movement that Mirror's Edge bases its mechanics around. Parkour is the act of traversing urban landscapes as quickly as possible, with no regard for the sidewalks or any other traditional demarcators of movement. Mirror's Edge was released in 2008, right around the time parkour had reached its cultural peak and companies had started to capitalize on the movement. EA was just another one of these companies, and Mirror's Edge just a game that was trying to sell the parkour fantasy. But what is often lost in this commercialization is that parkour is more than just the act of jumping off things. There's a philosophy behind the actions. Writing about traceurs, as parkour practitioners often call themselves, Michael Atkinson describes the movement as a physical, cultural practice that engages a critique of late modern capitalist urban life and its ideological, social, and physical architecture through a unique form of collective, athletic, passive resistance. Mirror's Edge, as designed, resembles very little of this philosophy, but that doesn't mean that it is inaccessible to those who play the game. The key part of that pitch is that runners see the city in a different way. The game attempts to literally mechanize this idea. Objects in the world that you can vault off of, climb on, run alongside, or just generally interact with are highlighted in red with what is called runner's vision. As a practical matter, this guides the player through the level, but it also demonstrates how Faith is seeing the city. A pile of boxes becomes a springboard, a pipe becomes a balance beam, rooftops become pathways
and conduits, possibilities, and routes to escape.
The core idea of the game is that runners see the world in a way that other people don't, and runner's vision is the game indulging players in that fantasy, giving them a glimpse into what it's like to see the world differently. But the way that this mechanic hands the player this fantasy makes it fall flat. I'm not saying that the mechanic shouldn't be there, it's super useful for people playing the game for their first time, but it's also outside the spirit of parkour. The idea of seeing the world differently is something traceurs often talk about. In parkour we have this thing called parkour vision. Before I started doing parkour, I saw this wall as telling me I can go straight, I can turn left there, but once I started, the amount of paths I can take becomes infinite. There is no limit. I can go wherever I want to. That is freedom because you know you are not enclosed anymore. Those are the words of a Singaporean traceur named Ash, and while the idea of parkour vision should track nicely onto runner's vision, it really doesn't. Runner's vision doesn't give you infinite paths, it gives you one. The limits are explicit. When you see a wall with a red highlight, it's telling you you can do a wall run. It's exactly like Ash says, I can go straight, I can turn left there. Runner's vision simulates parkour without any of the freeing effects. It's a funnel. But those infinite possibilities do exist in Mirror's Edge. You just have to look away from the right path in order to find them. And this is where Mirror's Edge not only becomes a game that still matters 10 years after its release, but also a game that starts to resemble the parkour movement it's capitalizing on. To better explain just what this is, I'll give an example. Early in the game, there's a moment where Faith falls out of a vent and is met by a group of cops waiting for her at the end of a hallway.
Drop the bag and put your hands so we can see them!
Players will turn to the right and be met with a red staircase. Running up these stairs like a normal person is perfectly fine and will get you where you need to go and away from the cops safely.
Flyers are going crazy. Get out of there, Faith.
But more attentive players, or players running through the game for a second time, might realize that they can run up and propel themselves off the last wall, instead of climbing the final story of stairs, shaving maybe a second of time off. Then you realize that there's a small box at the bottom of the steps that you can climb on first to avoid climbing the first story of steps as well. And then you realize that there's a wall across from that box that you can run along and propel yourself off of in order to avoid the more time-consuming act of climbing the crate. And now all of a sudden you aren't just taking the fantasy that the game handed you, but you are in fact seeing the game in a different way. The hidden pathways within the game are becoming visible to you, and you start to truly embody the character of Faith, seeing infinite possibilities and always looking for a shorter way through space. Now when you look at those stairs, you can go wherever you want to. And those are just a few changes that I made going through that section a few times. I've played Mirror's Edge a bunch, but I'm not a speedrunner who's poured thousands of hours into mastering the intricacies of the mechanics and tearing every inch of every level apart. If you are, that section looks more like this.
Hey, drop the bag and put your hands where we can see them.
Just get the hell out of there.
Writing about parkour, Jaclyn Law says that it's about curiosity and seeing possibilities, looking at a lamppost or bus shelter as an extension of the sidewalk. It's easy to make the connection between that and Faith saying that rooftops become pathways and conduits. After all, that is the connection that Mirror's Edge is trying to make as a game about parkour. Yet it only really does so when people begin to speedrun it, or at least look for shorter paths with a speedrunning mindset. Writing about speedrunning, Cat Brewster says something very similar to what Law says about parkour. To a speedrunner, it's all map textures, skips, glitches, cyan doors, and turkey dinners. In the case of both speedrunners and traceurs, we have attempts to remove objects from the context in which they were built, to reappropriate in order to create something new. Both cities and video games are built to facilitate very specific types of experiences. Cities are built to facilitate commerce, video games are also built to facilitate commerce. But they're also designed to allow for some idealized version of play. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds questioning what that version of play is, especially for a game made by a studio full of people, but I feel pretty safe in assuming that it wasn't this.
Good. So he's going to clip out of bounds, and then now he's going to pause the game at the right time when the objective goes to the train one. And he's gonna, now he's in the bottom section of chapter 4, and right here he's just gonna do some bunny hops. It speeds you up a little bit, and then he's gonna try and do something, a strat here called blue wall.
I think we can safely define this as subverting intended design. What we're seeing here is the result of thousands of hours of work done by dozens of people who have attempted to tear Mirror's Edge apart and find out what it is that makes the game work and then exploit those things to break the game wide open. And they have become non-existent to the code that governs the game's usual functions. What we're watching here is barely Mirror's Edge. It's performance art that uses Mirror's Edge as its stage, and it's beautiful. The constant movement is mesmerizing. The level of expertise and dedication necessary to perfect something like this is extraordinary, and there's something freeing about watching somebody tear something apart that was specifically built to confine you. When a group of Ocarina of Time speedrunners found a glitch in 2011 that completely changed their perception of what was possible in the game, Brewster describes their experience as follows. The game fell apart in front of them, and they were desperately trying to put the most efficient pieces end to end. In a speedrun, something new is created using the disparate parts of something that already existed. This is very similar to how traceurs use the city. Just like games are not built for speedrunning, the city is not built for parkour. Like speedrunning, it may be permitted or perhaps even encouraged in some cases, but it is not the expected norm. Parkour creates new spaces in a city that are removed from the streets and sidewalks designed to lead people in ways beneficial to those who designed them. A city from their experiential reality is constructed for efficiency, commercial interests, public control, and social surveillance. But by refusing to abide by these existing forms of movement, they are creating a city that is more playful, personal, and experimental. They experience the city in a way that is in line with their personal desires, not in the way that is prescribed to them. For traceurs, the materialities of the urban landscape not only add up to form a functional space, but also create spaces where we can be more playful. Much like with speedrunning, we have a new form created from the parts of an existing one. But because the city is not built for parkour, there is always the risk of the city pushing back. Atkinson quotes a Montreal tracer named Darren, who says, "This is a place designed for lawyers and bankers, not us. I know that for sure when the cops show up and tell us, despite the fact that we are doing nothing illegal, to get lost or we'll be fined for being a public nuisance." As Ali Moul details, spaces used for parkour often become contested space. Neighborhoods and parks put up signs that say no free running. Parkour facilities have been established that allow for the activity to exist, but also contain it. Police interference is threatened, even if there is no grounds for it to actually be carried out. Not only is the city not built for parkour in the first place, but it has actively pushed back against the sport's emergence.
It's been described as a sport, but in the West Sussex town of Horsham, it's been banned in the town centre, and anyone found free running could face a fine. The council want to come up with a compromise, which would be a sort of a happy balance for everybody, maybe. It's to allow people to do this free running, but also to protect the public, and that is to give an indoor space.
And what needs to happen is actually a conversation about how we use our public spaces, how they're being designed, how people are reacting to them. Just to have to say, like, you're allowed to do this, we think it's nice for you, we think it's good and healthy, but we're going to put you in this closed space where nobody can see you, is no solution to anything. And I think it's not understanding what the potential of parkour is and how it has huge benefits to a large section of the population, actually.
And the traceurs often respond by holding their ground. In fact, the pushback they receive only furthers the notion that they are finding a new function for this place that has not been designated by the official urban narrative.
As parkour's banned in Horsham now, we better turn this one the other way.
We don't see this pushback happen as much with speedrunning, and most of what we do see seems at most incidental. This is presumably because while traceurs exist among the public, speedrunners play in their own instances of these worlds. Yet, I think there is an extent to which speedrunning is at odds with the interests of the modern video game publisher. To use an example of what it is that publishers want, let's take a look at Ubisoft, who in a lot of ways exemplifies the modern video game publisher. In their financial earnings for the past fiscal year, Ubisoft reported that 57% of their total revenue came from back catalog games, or games released before fiscal year 2019, and 32% of their revenue came from what they call player recurring investment, or PRI. PRI includes in-game items, DLCs, season pass, subscription, and advertising. Ubisoft is not simply making money by selling new games. They are making money by selling new content inside games from the past handful of years, and it's easy to see why they'd adopt a strategy like this. As a slide from their Q3 fiscal year 2018 earnings report states, digital extra content requires much lower levels of R&D and marketing. This 15-year-old horse in Assassin's Creed Origins was 1/4 the launch price of the game, but it definitely wasn't 1/4 the development cost for Ubisoft. Stuff like this has a higher return on investment, and that's why companies rely on it. And it's not just Ubisoft doing this either. EA, Activision, Take-Two, Square Enix, Capcom, Bethesda, Bandai Namco, Warner Brothers, Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, take your pick, they all do it. Some are less blatant about it than others, but this is the modus operandi for all video game publishers in 2019. So, how does any of this relate to speedrunning? Well, all of these games as a service type models are working off a pretty simple assumption. In his recent book Speedrun Science, speedrunner Eric Koziel, aka OmniGamer, says that if a game is enjoyable, people will try to find ways to extend that enjoyment beyond the core experience. This is what publishers are counting on when they continue to sell new content inside of a years-old game, that people will buy it with the hopes of extending their enjoyment of a game they already like. What speedrunning does is it shows us a different way to extend the lifespan of a game, and one that doesn't require any additional payment. Mirror's Edge had a single DLC pack in 2009, and that was it. Speedrunners have played the game long after it was considered dead by EA. Speedrunning is a form of play completely removed from the controlled marketing narratives and content rollouts of a publisher. To echo Faith, it's a different way of seeing games. And at a time when games are turning into marketplaces that are designed to make us see nothing other than that cool new skin that's on sale, I think it's important to see games differently. Much like Parkour, speedruns openly question the dominant narrative of how a space is supposed to be used. Wenbin Liu and Tim Bonnell quote a Singaporean traceur named Chi, who described parkour to them as art in motion. I really like this description, and think it applies equally to speedrunning. And that's not just because Mirror's Edge any% runs look like cool glitch art either. Earlier I compared speedrunning to performance art. Koziel talks about it as a medium. Whatever metaphor you want to use for it, these are creative acts. They are creating new forms of interaction with the world. As Chi says, the environment becomes a canvas and you are the paintbrush. Running of both types gives people creative power over a world that was created to have power over them, and that is truly revolutionary. Through the subversion of traditional game design and the creation of new modes of play, the Mirror's Edge speedrunning community has delivered on the game's parkour promise in a way that the game by itself not only didn't, but due to the subversive nature of parkour, never really could have in the first place.